The sky over Earth turned red as the Empire's warships descended, casting vast shadows over oceans and cities. Each ship was a marvel of engineering, bristling with weapons that could disintegrate mountains and shields that could withstand the force of supernovae. The flagship Vorak led the fleet, a behemoth the size of Manhattan, its black hull gleaming as it eclipsed the sun. Humanity's governments scrambled to respond. In war rooms around the globe, leaders sat in stunned silence as reports poured in. The Xarian Empire was not unknown to the galaxy. Rumors of its conquests had been whispered for decades by extraterrestrial travelers, though no one had believed them. Now, those whispers were deafening roars as the Empire demanded Earth's submission. The broadcast came at noon, hijacking every screen, speaker, and device on the planet. General Calther, a towering Xarian with scaled silver skin and eyes like molten gold, addressed humanity. His voice was calm but carried an edge of contempt. "Citizens of Earth," he began, his tone dripping with disdain, "you stand on the brink of history. Your planet, a backwater of no consequence, will now serve the glory of the Xarian Empire. Resist, and you will face annihilation. Submit, and you may live to see the dawn of a new order." Across the globe, panic erupted. Cities were evacuated. Military forces mobilized, though no one believed they stood a chance against the Empire's technology. Humans were clever but unprepared. The Xarian Empire had spent centuries perfecting the art of conquest. Resistance was, as Calther said, futile. In Detroit, the arrival of the Xarian forces was met with stunned silence. Massive mechs, their hulking forms shimmering with energy fields, marched through the streets. Civilians scattered as drones zipped overhead, scanning for signs of resistance. Buildings were commandeered, their occupants herded into containment zones. But in a dingy repair shop on the outskirts of the city, the invasion was merely an inconvenience. Rusty Collins, a middle-aged mechanic with a perpetual scowl and grease-streaked hands, was too engrossed in his work to notice the chaos. He was hunched over a plasma generator, muttering curses under his breath as he tried to fix a finicky circuit board. "Come on, you piece of junk," Rusty growled, tightening a bolt with his oversized wrench. The machine sputtered, sparks flying, and he slammed the wrench against it in frustration. "I don't have all day." Outside, the ground trembled as a war mech stomped by, its mechanical joints groaning. A lesser man might have panicked, but Rusty merely glanced out the window, frowning. "Great," he muttered. "Another damn parade or something." He turned back to his work, oblivious to the fact that the mech had paused, its crimson visor locking onto his shop. Its scanners detected unusual power surges. Rusty's homemade generator, built from salvaged alien tech, had caught the Empire's attention. The shop's lights flickered as the mech powered up its weapon systems. Rusty barely had time to look up before the building's front wall was obliterated, debris flying everywhere. His precious plasma generator was reduced to molten slag. For a moment, Rusty stared at the destruction in stunned silence. Then his face twisted into a scowl of pure rage. "Oh, you've done it now," he said, grabbing his wrench from the workbench. He stepped out of the wreckage, glaring up at the towering machine. "You think you can just blow up my shop and walk away?" The mech's pilot, an Xarian soldier encased in a sleek cockpit, didn't bother responding. It raised one of its massive arms, aiming a plasma cannon directly at Rusty. Rusty didn't flinch. Instead, he hurled his wrench with all his might. The tool spun through the air, striking the mech's targeting array with a deafening clang. Sparks flew as the cannon misfired, sending a bolt of plasma into a nearby building. "Yeah, that's what I thought," Rusty shouted, his voice echoing through the street. "You're nothing without your fancy gadgets." The mech staggered, its systems struggling to recalibrate. Rusty seized the opportunity, running toward the machine's leg. Despite his stocky frame, he moved with surprising agility, leaping onto the mech and clambering up its armored plating. Inside the cockpit, the pilot snarled, trying to shake him off. Rusty held on, using his wrench to pry open an access panel. With a practiced hand, he began rewiring the mech systems, muttering to himself as he worked. Let's see. Red wire, blue wire. Ah, here we go. Seconds later, the mech froze, its limbs locking in place. Rusty grinned triumphantly as he swung into the cockpit, knocking the stunned pilot out cold. Not so tough now, are you? He said, settling into the controls. It took him less than a minute to figure out the basics after all. A machine was a machine, no matter where it came from. As the mech stood upright, Rusty tested its weapons, firing a volley of plasma blasts into the sky. The other Xarian forces turned to face him, their sensors blaring. Oh, you want some of this too? Rusty growled, gripping the controls. Come get it. The battle for Earth had begun, and humanity's first act of defiance came not from generals or soldiers, but from a single, angry mechanic with a wrench. Detroit was unrecognizable. Streets once filled with the hum of traffic were now cratered wastelands, littered with smoldering debris. The sky was thick with smoke as Xarian drones buzzed overhead, their scanners sweeping for survivors. War mechs stomped through the city, their heavy steps reverberating through the rubble, searching for any sign of resistance. In the midst of this chaos, Rusty Collins was piloting one of the Empire's own war machines, his face a mask of grim determination. His commandeered mech was a patchwork of dents and scorch marks, but it was functional and Rusty was using it to full effect. The mech's plasma cannon fired, obliterating a squad of Xarian soldiers who had been foolish enough to approach. The recoil rocked the cockpit, and Rusty gritted his teeth, wrestling the controls. Why do these things always have to be so over-engineered? He muttered, slapping a flickering display with his palm until it stabilized. They should have let me design these things. Would VE made them less flashy and more useful. On the horizon, more mechs were advancing. Rusty could see their glowing visors cutting through the smoke, their weapons primed to fire. He wasn't intimidated. If anything, he looked annoyed. Great, he said, sarcasm dripping from his voice. More tin cans for me to deal with. Rusty wasn't a strategist, but he was a mechanic, and that meant he understood machines better than most. Every movement of the enemy mechs told him something: how their joints moved, where their armor was weakest, and, most importantly, where their power supplies were located. As the first mech charged him, Rusty sidestepped, firing a concentrated plasma shot at its knee joint. The armor there was thinner, designed for flexibility, and the blast severed the joint cleanly. The mech collapsed, sparks flying as it struggled to regain balance. See? Simple physics. Rusty shouted, grinning. He didn't have long to celebrate. Two more mechs flanked him, their energy cannons charging. Rusty quickly fired his own thrusters, propelling his mech backward just as the enemy's blasts scorched the ground where he had been standing. This thing's got rockets? Why didn't I notice that before? Rusty muttered, toggling switches and pressing buttons to see what else the stolen mech could do. A pair of missile pods extended from the shoulders, and Rusty's grin widened. Oh, you guys are in trouble now. With the press of a button, the missiles launched, streaking through the air and slamming into one of the advancing mechs. The explosion ripped through its torso, sending shrapnel flying in every direction. The second mech hesitated, as if reconsidering its approach. Rusty leaned forward in the cockpit, his voice dripping with mockery. What's the matter? Scared of a little human ingenuity? The remaining mech charged, but Rusty was ready. He activated the plasma blade stored in the arm of his stolen machine, a glowing, crackling weapon that extended like a blade of light. When the enemy mech lunged, Rusty sidestepped again and swung the blade, severing its arm. The enemy stumbled, and Rusty followed up with a devastating blow to its head, crumpling it like a tin can. Rusty's unlikely allies. As Rusty battled his way through Detroit, word of his exploits spread. The scattered remnants of Detroit's population, hiding in basements and shelters, watched in awe as the lone mech rampaged against the invaders. Footage from survivors' drones captured every moment, broadcasting Rusty's defiance to the rest of the world. In an underground resistance bunker, a small group of fighters huddled around a monitor. They watched as Rusty tore through yet another squad of Xarian soldiers, his unconventional tactics leaving piles of wreckage in his wake. "Who is this guy?" one of the fighters asked. "Don't know," another replied. "But he's got more guts than anyone I've ever seen." Inspired by Rusty's actions, the resistance fighters began organizing. They used his attacks as a distraction, launching ambushes and sabotaging Xarian supply lines. For the first time since the invasion began, humanity had a glimmer of hope. Rusty, of course, was oblivious to all of this. His focus was entirely on surviving and making the Xarians pay for destroying his shop. Enter the Praetorian Guard. The Empire wasn't blind to the threat Rusty posed. General Calther watched the footage from the bridge of the Vorak, his expression darkening with every passing second. A lone human untrained, undisciplined was wreaking havoc on his carefully planned invasion. It was an insult to the Empire's reputation. "This mechanic," Calther growled, the word dripping with disdain. "He has made a mockery of our forces." An officer stepped forward, bowing slightly. "General, shall we deploy the Praetorian Guard?" Calther's molten gold eyes gleamed. The Praetorian Guard were the Empire's elite soldiers, genetically enhanced warriors clad in advanced power armor. Each one was a match for an entire battalion. "Yes," Calther said, his voice icy. "Send them. And bring me this human alive. I want him to witness the destruction of his planet before he dies." Rusty's next challenge. Rusty was taking a rare moment to rest, leaning back in the cockpit of his mech. He'd found a relatively safe spot to regroup, a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. As he tinkered with the controls, trying to improve the mech's performance, his comms crackled with a transmission. It was a garbled voice, barely audible over the static. "This is Resistance. Calling the mech pilot. Do you copy?" Rusty frowned, tapping the comms unit. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who wants to help," the voice replied. "You've been drawing their attention, but the Praetorian Guard is coming. You can't fight them alone." Rusty snorted. "Watch me." The voice hesitated. "They're not like the ones you've faced so far. They're faster, smarter, and better armed." Rusty's eyes narrowed. "Then I'd better get to work. Thanks for the heads up." He ended the transmission and grabbed his wrench, rolling up his sleeves. The mech was powerful, but it had its limits, and Rusty knew he'd need every edge he could get. As he worked, a determined grin spread across his face. "Faster, smarter, better armed," he muttered. "Sounds like a challenge." Outside, the ground trembled. The Praetorian Guard had arrived, their polished armor gleaming under the dull, smoke-filled sky. They moved with precision, their weapons at the ready, their visors glowing like embers. Rusty looked up from his work, his grin turning into a scowl. "All right, boys," he said, hefting his wrench. "Let's see if you can handle a little old-fashioned elbow grease." The city's skyline was a jagged silhouette against the roiling smoke, the once bustling metropolis reduced to a battleground. The streets were eerily silent, save for the distant clatter of debris and the occasional roar of an exploding fuel tank. Rusty Collins was crouched in the cockpit of his stolen Xarian mech, scanning the horizon with narrowed eyes. He didn't have to wait long. A squad of Praetorian Guards emerged from the haze, their sleek black armor reflecting the faint glow of fires. Each soldier moved with unnerving precision, their boots crunching softly against the rubble. Unlike the standard Xarian troops, these warriors carried an air of menace, their weapons humming with barely contained energy. From his vantage point inside the mech, Rusty muttered under his breath. "So, these are the big shots, huh? They don't look so tough." But as one of the guards extended a hand and unleashed a searing plasma beam that vaporized a nearby building, Rusty's confidence wavered slightly. "Okay," he muttered, gripping the controls, "maybe a little tough. The first encounter, Rusty powered up his mech, its systems flickering to life. The hum of the energy core resonated through the cockpit as he gritted his teeth. The mech's HUD highlighted the approaching guards, flashing red with multiple warning indicators. "They've got toys." "I've got Bertha," Rusty said, patting his trusty wrench, which rested beside him. The lead guard raised a massive energy rifle, aiming directly at Rusty's mech. Before they could fire, Rusty activated his thrusters, launching his machine sideways and into cover. The blast missed him by inches, carving a molten trench into the asphalt. "All right, smart guy, let's see how you like this," Rusty growled. With a flick of a lever, he fired a barrage of missiles from the mech's shoulder pods. The projectiles streaked through the air, but the guards moved faster than Rusty anticipated. They scattered with inhuman agility, dodging the explosions with ease. One of them even leapt onto a crumbling wall, using it as a springboard to close the distance between them. Rusty's eyes widened. "Oh, come on. You're supposed to be slow in that armor." The guard slammed into Rusty's mech, claws glowing with energy as they tore through the outer plating. Sparks flew, and the cockpit shuddered violently. Rusty swore, grabbing Bertha and swinging it at the control panel. The mech's arm jerked upward, catching the guard in the midsection and sending them flying into a pile of debris. "That's right," Rusty shouted. "You're not the only one who can improvise." Fighting smarter, not harder, the remaining guards weren't deterred. They coordinated, moving as a unit to encircle Rusty. Plasma bolts streaked through the air, forcing him to maneuver erratically. Each hit drained the mech's shields, which Rusty had already patched together with salvaged components. But Rusty had an advantage: he knew how to adapt. Over the years, he'd worked with every kind of broken machine imaginable, and the Xarian mech was no different. With a few frantic adjustments, he reconfigured the mech's power supply, redirecting energy from the weapons system to boost the shields. "Not bad for a guy with a wrench, huh?" Rusty muttered to himself, sweat dripping down his face. The guards closed in again, one of them vaulting onto the mech's back. Rusty grimaced as alarms blared in the cockpit. He swung the mech wildly, trying to shake the guard loose, but they held firm, slicing through cables and armor with ruthless efficiency. Rusty glanced at the manual override lever. Time for Plan B. Yanking the lever, Rusty ejected from the mech just as it overloaded. The cockpit's escape pod launched him into a nearby building as his machine exploded in a fiery burst. The guard on its back was incinerated instantly, and the shockwave knocked the others off their feet. Rusty crawled out of the escape pod, coughing from the dust. His trusty wrench was still in hand, its surface gleaming despite the chaos. "Well, that's one way to fix a problem," he muttered. "A new ally." Rusty didn't have time to catch his breath. The surviving guards were already regrouping, their glowing visors scanning for him. He ducked into an alley, clutching Bertha like a lifeline. As he rounded a corner, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Rusty tensed, raising his wrench, but the figure held up their hands in a gesture of peace. "Wait," they said. "I'm on your side." The voice was human, and as the figure stepped into the dim light, Rusty saw that it was a woman wearing a mix of scavenged armor and high-tech gadgets. Her face was smudged with grime, but her sharp eyes sparkled with determination. "Who the hell are you?" Rusty asked, lowering Bertha slightly. "Call me Jenna," she replied. "I'm with the Resistance." Rusty snorted. "Resistance? I thought everyone else gave up." "Not everyone," Jenna said. "We've been watching you. You've been giving them hell, but you're going to get yourself killed if you keep this up alone." Rusty scowled. "I've been doing fine so far." Jenna crossed her arms. "Really? Because it looks like you're out of a mech, surrounded, and running out of options." Rusty opened his mouth to argue but stopped when he heard the telltale hum of the guard's energy weapons. He glanced over his shoulder and muttered, "Fine. What's your plan?" Jenna smirked. Follow me. Turning the tables. Jenna led Rusty through a maze of side streets and alleys, eventually bringing him to an abandoned warehouse. Inside, a makeshift command center hummed with activity. Resistance fighters worked on salvaged drones, hacked Xarian tech, and improvised weaponry. Rusty looked around, his expression skeptical. "This your big army?" "It's more than it looks," Jenna said. "And with your skills, we might actually have a shot." Rusty raised an eyebrow. "What do you need me for?" "You've already got a bunch of fancy toys." Jenna grinned. "You're the guy who's been taking down Xarian war mechs with a wrench. You're exactly what we need, a mechanic who knows how to think outside the box." Before Rusty could respond, the ground shook. The Praetorian Guard had found them, their energy weapons blasting through the warehouse walls. "Looks like we're out of time," Rusty said, gripping Bertha tightly. "Let's show these guys what humans can do." Jenna tossed him a small Device 8 prototype energy shield she'd been working on. "You'll need this. Now let's make some noise." As the guard stormed the warehouse, Rusty and the resistance fighters sprang into action. Improvised turrets fired volleys of plasma bolts, drones swarmed overhead, and Rusty, wielding Bertha and his newfound shield, charged headlong into the fray. The battle was chaos, but for the first time, Rusty wasn't alone. And together, they made the Praetorian Guard regret ever setting foot on Earth. The sun rose over Detroit, its faint light struggling to penetrate the thick, smoky air. The city was a wasteland, a graveyard of Xarian war machines and the remnants of humanity's defiance. For the first time since the invasion began, the Empire had suffered a real setback. Rusty Collins, the reluctant hero, had become a rallying symbol for resistance across the planet. But General Calther was not one to suffer humiliation lightly. From his command deck aboard the Vorak, Calther stared at the holographic projection of Detroit. His molten gold eyes burned with fury. Around him, his officers cowered, knowing better than to interrupt their general when he was enraged. "This, mechanic," Calther growled, his voice low and venomous. "He has defied the Empire for the last time." An officer stepped forward cautiously. "General, the Dread Titan is ready for deployment." Calther turned to him, his expression softening into a cruel smile. "Excellent. Let the humans witness their true insignificance." The Dread Titan descends. The Dread Titan was the pinnacle of Xarian engineering, a mech that dwarfed all others. Standing over 200 feet tall, it bristled with weaponry, plasma cannons, missile pods, and energy blades capable of cleaving through starship hulls. Its armor was reinforced with an energy field that could absorb even the most concentrated attacks. In Xarian history, no force had ever stood against it and survived. The Titan descended into Detroit like a god of destruction, its massive thrusters melting what little remained of the buildings below. The ground shook as it landed, its enormous feet crushing everything beneath them. Its arrival was punctuated by a booming voice, amplified to echo across the city. "Humanity," Calther's voice proclaimed, "your defiance ends here. Witness the might of the Xarian Empire." Rusty, huddled with the resistance in an underground bunker, felt the tremors and heard the broadcast. He glanced at Jenna, who was furiously typing on a console, trying to pull up schematics of the Titan. "This thing looks big," Rusty said, understatement dripping from his voice. "Big doesn't cover it," Jenna replied, her face pale. "The Dread Titan is a walking apocalypse. Its shields alone are nearly impenetrable." Rusty leaned on Bertha, his trusty wrench, and raised an eyebrow. "Nearly?" Jenna hesitated. "There's a weak point. The reactor core is located at the base of the spine. But getting to it — Rusty cut her off. "Is impossible." "Got it." The bunker shook again as the Titan unleashed a barrage of plasma blasts, leveling entire blocks. The resistance fighters looked to Rusty, their faces a mix of fear and hope. He sighed, gripping Bertha tightly. "Guess it's time to take this up a notch." David versus Goliath. Rusty's plan was suicidal, even by his standards. The Resistance had cobbled together a handful of drones, improvised EMP charges, and a salvaged Xarian mech for him to pilot. It was a pitiful arsenal compared to the Titan, but Rusty wasn't deterred. "All right, folks," Rusty said, climbing into the mech. "I'll keep this monster busy. You lot focus on getting those EMPs close enough to drop its shields." Jenna nodded, her jaw set. "We'll do our part. Just don't get yourself killed." Rusty grinned. "No promises." As the mech powered up, Rusty felt a surge of adrenaline. He'd faced impossible odds before, but this was different. The Dread Titan wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol of the Empire's overwhelming power. And Rusty, the grease-stained mechanic, was about to take it head-on. The battle begins. The Dread Titan loomed over the city like a nightmare made flesh. Its plasma cannons fired in coordinated blasts, obliterating entire Resistance strongholds. Rusty's mech burst onto the scene, its thrusters roaring as it dodged debris and returned fire. His missiles struck the Titan's legs, leaving scorch marks but little else. "Great," Rusty muttered. "This thing's built like a damn tank." The Titan turned its attention to him, its massive head swiveling to track his movements. A low hum signaled the charging of its primary weapon, a plasma beam so powerful it could vaporize a starship. Rusty's eyes widened. "Oh, no you don't," he shouted, firing his thrusters to full power. The beam lanced out, narrowly missing him and carving a molten trench into the ground. Rusty circled around the Titan, firing every weapon his mech had. He aimed for the joints, trying to slow it down, but the Titan shrugged off the attacks like a bear swatting flies. Meanwhile, Jenna and the Resistance fighters worked frantically. Using salvaged Xarian tech, they rigged an array of EMP devices onto drones. The plan was simple: get the drones close enough to the Titan to disable its shields. But the Titan's anti-air defenses made the task nearly impossible. One by one, the drones were picked off by the Titan's automated turrets. Rusty saw this and grit his teeth. "I guess it's up to me." A desperate gamble. Rusty activated his mech's thrusters, launching himself onto the Titan's leg. He clambered upward, using Bertha to pry open access panels and disable key systems as he went. The Titan shuddered, trying to shake him off, but Rusty held firm. Inside the Vorak, General Calther watched in disbelief as the human mechanic scaled the Dread Titan like an insect. "Impossible!" Calther roared. "Bring him down!" The Titan swatted at Rusty with a massive arm, narrowly missing him. Rusty clung to a hydraulic joint, wrenching it open and jamming Bertha into the mechanism. Sparks flew as the joint seized, and the Titan's arm locked in place. "That'll slow you down," Rusty muttered, climbing higher. Finally, he reached the reactor core, located at the base of the Titan's spine. It was protected by layers of armor and energy shields, but Rusty wasn't deterred. He pulled out the last EMP charge Jenna had given him and slapped it onto the core. The Titan roared as the EMP detonated. Its shields flickered and died, leaving it vulnerable for the first time. The Resistance seized the moment, launching a barrage of rockets and plasma blasts at the now exposed reactor. Rusty grinned as the core began to overload. That's how you fix a giant robot. The fall of the Titan. The Dread Titan staggered, its systems failing one by one. Explosions rippled through its massive frame as the reactor destabilized. Rusty leapt from the mech, activating his emergency thrusters to glide to safety. The Titan toppled like a felled skyscraper, crashing into the city with a deafening roar. The ground shook as the behemoth was finally defeated. From his vantage point, Rusty watched the destruction with a mix of relief and exhaustion. His comm crackled as Jenna's voice came through. "You did it," she shouted. "The Titan's down." Rusty chuckled, wiping sweat and grime from his face. "Told you I had it under control." Victory and legacy. The defeat of the Dread Titan marked a turning point in the war. The Empire, humiliated by the loss of their greatest weapon, began to retreat. Inspired by Rusty's defiance, resistance movements across the planet rose up, striking back with newfound confidence. Rusty, however, wanted none of the glory. As the resistance celebrated, he quietly returned to his ruined repair shop. There, amidst the rubble, he picked up Bertha and began fixing a generator he'd salvaged from the battlefield. Jenna found him there later, shaking her head. "You just saved the planet, and you're back to fixing junk?" Rusty shrugged. "Somebody's got to keep the lights on." And so, Rusty Collins, the man who defeated an empire with nothing but grit, ingenuity, and a wrench, returned to the one thing he truly loved, fixing things. But to the rest of humanity, he was a legend, a symbol of what one determined individual could accomplish in the face of overwhelming odds.